The morning Thomas Caldwell decided to hunt down his missing property, frost still clung to the red clay roads of Murray County, Georgia. It was February 1839, and the air tasted of iron and coming rain. He stood on the wraparound porch of Caldwell Manor, a two-story plantation house that overlooked 300 acres of cotton fields, now barren, and waiting for spring planting. In his hand he clutched a worn leather ledger containing the names and descriptions of 47 enslaved people. His father's inheritance, his burden, his wealth. 3 of those names had vanished 6 days ago. Samuel, 28 years old, strong back, good teeth. Eliza, 19, house servant, light-skinned, and Eliza's son, Joseph, barely 7 years old. They disappeared during the night, leaving behind nothing but cold ashes in the quarters and a single set of footprints heading north toward the ridgeline, where the mountains began their slow climb toward Tennessee. Thomas had sent his overseer, Dutch Morgan, and 4 slave catchers into those hills 3 days ago. None had returned. Now, as he watched the sun struggle through gray clouds, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, genuine fear. Not the manageable anxiety of crop failure or debt, but the primitive dread that comes from knowing the world contains forces beyond accounting books and property law. "You're making a mistake going up there." Thomas turned to find his wife Margaret standing in the doorway. She wore a heavy shawl despite the parlor fire burning inside, and her face had the drawn, sleepless quality he'd grown accustomed to over their 12 years of marriage. "What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you." Since their daughter died of fever 2 winters ago, Margaret had become a ghost in her own home, drifting from room to room, speaking only when necessary. "I can't lose 5 men and do nothing," Thomas said. "The other planters are watching. If word spreads that Caldwell slaves can simply walk away, it's not about the slaves." Margaret's voice was flat, certain. "You know what's up there." Thomas did know. Every white man in Murray County knew. The few spoke of it openly. The Cherokee called those mountains G, which meant the long place, but the settlers had their own name, the Breathing Hills. On still nights you could hear wind moving through unseen passages, a sound like slow exhalation. The Cherokee had sealed the caves before the government forced them west on the Trail of Tears, performing rituals that lasted 3 days and nights. The soldiers who supervised the removal reported seeing smoke rise from the ridgeline and drums that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. "Cherokee superstition," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then why haven't your men come back?" Thomas had no answer for that. He descended the porch steps and walked toward the stables where his horse, a bay gelding named Brutus, waited with visible unease. The animal's ears were flat against its skull, and its eyes showed too much white. By mid-morning, Thomas had assembled a search party of 8 men. There was Carson Webb, who owned the adjacent property and had lost a slave to the same northern flight path last month. There was Reverend Amos Price, a Methodist circuit rider, who carried a Bible in one hand and a Colt revolver in the other, believing equally in salvation and lead. The remaining 5 were professional slave catchers from Alabama, hard men with harder reputations, men who tracked human beings the way others tracked deer. They rode in silence toward the Etowah Creek Valley. The landscape changed as they climbed, the cultivated flatlands giving way to dense hardwood forests still bare from winter. Oak and hickory branches formed skeletal canopies overhead, and the ground became rocky, treacherous with hidden roots and sudden drops. Around noon, they found the first sign of Dutch Morgan's party, a campsite near a creek bend where the water ran fast and clear over smooth stones. The fire pit was cold, days old, gear lay scattered as if abandoned in haste. But what stopped Thomas cold was the arrangement of stones around the fire. They formed a perfect circle, and in the center someone had placed a deer skull with its antlers pointing north toward the ridgeline. "That's a Cherokee marker," said one of the Alabama men, a lean tracker named Silas Cobb. He spat tobacco juice onto the frozen ground. "Means turn back. Means you're crossing into sacred ground." "Sacred to who?" Carson Webb demanded. The Cherokee are gone. Government moved them out last year. Moved the people, Silas said quietly, didn't move what they left behind. They continued north, and as the afternoon light began to fade, the forest changed. The trees grew larger here. Ancient hemlocks and white pines that predated European settlement. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, nothing but the sound of horses' hooves on stone, and the occasional creak of saddle leather. Then Reverend Price stopped his horse so suddenly that Thomas nearly collided with him. "Do you hear that?" Thomas listened. At first he heard nothing. Then gradually he became aware of a sound so low it was more vibration than noise. A deep thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Rhythmic, deliberate, like a massive heartbeat. "Drums," Carson Webb whispered. But there were no drums visible, no Cherokee villages, nothing, an empty forest and the steady, impossible pulse rising from below. They found the cave entrance an hour later, just as dusk was settling into the valleys like smoke. It was larger than Thomas had expected, a gaping mouth in the hillside, perhaps 20 feet wide and 12 feet high, framed by limestone that gleamed pale in the dying light. Strange markings covered the rock face around the opening, spirals and circles, zigzag patterns that suggested lightning or serpents and figures that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. What stopped them all was the smell, not decay, exactly. Something older, mustier, like the scent of a root cellar that hasn't been opened in years, mixed with something Thomas couldn't identify. Mineral organic, wrong, Mr. Morgan, Thomas called into the darkness. His voice echoed strangely, as if the cave were much larger than it appeared. "Dutch Morgan, are you in there?" No answer came back, only that deep, rhythmic thrumming, louder now, unmistakable. Silas Cobb dismounted and approached the entrance with a pine torch. The firelight revealed the cave, extending back into darkness, the walls smoothed as if by water over countless centuries. The markings continued inside, growing more complex and disturbing. Humanoid figures with animal heads, scenes of violence and ritual, symbols that hurt to look at for too long. "I'll be damned," Silas breathed. On the cave floor, just inside the entrance, lay a trail of personal effects. A knife, a leather water flask, a wool coat Thomas recognized as belonging to Dutch Morgan, and beyond them, scattered like breadcrumbs, leading deeper into the earth, more items. A boot, a hat, a pistol still in its holster. They went in, Carson Webb said unnecessarily. They went in and what? Forgot they were wearing clothes. Thomas dismounted, his legs unsteady. Every instinct screamed at him to mount his horse and ride hard for home, to forget his missing slaves and his missing overseer, to seal this place in his memory and never speak of it again. But he was Thomas Caldwell, owner of 300 acres and 47 souls, a man of standing in the community. He couldn't show weakness, couldn't run from darkness like a child. He took the torch from Silas. "I'm going in. The rest of you stay here." "And no, sir," Reverend Price interrupted. He drew his revolver. "We go together, or none of us go." In the end, 6 men entered the cave, to stay with the horses, weapons drawn, watching the tree line for threats that might come from outside rather than within. The passage descended gradually, the ceiling lowering until they had to duck, then rose again into a chamber roughly 30 feet across. More markings covered every surface here, illuminated by their torches in flickering orange light. Thomas saw depictions of ceremonies, circles of dancers, raised hands, prone figures that might have been offerings or might have been something worse. And then he saw the first body. It was one of the Alabama trackers, a man named Virgil Cook. He sat with his back against the cave wall, eyes open but unseeing, mouth stretched in an expression that might have been terror or ecstasy. His skin was gray, waxy, and when Carson Webb touched his shoulder, the body was cold as the surrounding stone. "Dead at least 2 days, Carson said. "But look, no wounds, no blood. It's like his heart just stopped." They found the other bodies deeper in, scattered through connecting chambers like pieces of a broken puzzle. Dutch Morgan lay face down near a pit that descended beyond their torchlight. one hand outstretched towards something they couldn't see. The remaining trackers were positioned throughout the cave system, all with that same expression, that same gray pallor. What killed them? Thomas asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. Reverend Price had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cave's chill. Whatever it is, it's still here. I can feel it watching. The thrumming had grown louder, more insistent, and Thomas realized with growing horror that it synchronized with his own heartbeat, that the cave itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with his lungs. Then Silas Cobb, who had moved ahead to scout, let out a strangled sound. Thomas hurried forward and emerged into the largest chamber yet. His torch illuminated only portions of it at a time, but what he saw defied comprehension. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with names, hundreds of names, maybe thousands, carved deep into the limestone with painstaking precision. And Thomas recognized them: Caldwell Manor, Webb Plantation, Henderson Estate, Price Holdings, Morgan Farm. Every plantation in Murray County was represented, along with dozens more Thomas had never heard of. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was the dates carved beside each name, dates that hadn't happened yet. Caldwell Manor established 1837, that was correct. But below it, Caldwell Manor burned 1841, and below that, Thomas Caldwell died 1840. Madness. Thomas's hand shook so badly the torch nearly fell. He moved along the wall, reading name after name, prediction after prediction. Plantations destroyed by fire, by drought, by flood, owners dead of fever, of violence, of suicide, slaves freed, slaves killed, slaves banished without trace. This is impossible, Carson Webb breathed beside him. These things haven't happened, not yet, Reverend Price said. His voice had changed, taken on a hollow quality, but they will, God help us, they will. In the center of the chamber stood an altar of sorts, a raised platform of fitted stones covered with objects Thomas couldn't identify. Bones arranged in patterns, clay figures with too many limbs, and in the very center, still glowing with faint light despite the darkness, a series of symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. The thrumming became deafening. The torches all went out simultaneously. In the absolute darkness, Thomas heard breathing that wasn't his own, movement that suggested massive size, and worst of all, voices. Cherokee voices chanting in rhythm with that impossible drum beat. Words he couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. You are not welcome here. You were never welcome here. This land remembers. When the torches flared back to life, and Thomas could never explain how they reignited on their own, the altar had changed. Where there had been bones and clay, now there were three figures, bound and kneeling. Samuel, Eliza, Joseph, they were alive, but silent, eyes wide, watching the white men with expressions that might have been pity. And behind them, carved fresh into the stone wall, still weeping limestone dust, were new words in English. We buried more than bones. We buried prophecy. Now you dig your own graves, Thomas ran. He wasn't proud of it, but neither was he ashamed. Some terrors demand flight, and this was one of them. He heard the others running too, heard Carson Webb sobbing, heard Reverend Price praying in a voice cracked with desperation. They burst from the cave into twilight that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness below. The horses were screaming, wild-eyed, pulling at their restraints. The two men left to guard them were gone, simply vanished, leaving behind only their weapons and the echo of their terror. Thomas mounted Bridges and rode harder than he'd ever ridden, branches whipping his face, the gilding's hoof slipping on loose stone. Behind him, he could hear the others doing the same, and beneath it all, that damn drumming following them down the mountain like a promise. They didn't speak during the ride home. What was there to say? That they'd seen the impossible. That something in those caves knew the future, or perhaps was making the future, carving reality into stone like a sculptor shapes clay. Thomas reached Caldwell Manor well after dark. Margaret stood on the porch with a lantern, and when she saw his face, she knew. What did you find? She asked. Thomas dismounted, legs barely holding him. He looked at his wife. at his house, at the field stretching into darkness. All of it suddenly felt temporary, borrowed, built on ground that would never truly be his. Our names, he said finally. We found our names and our endings. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat in his study with his father's ledger, reading through the names of the 47 people he claimed to own, and for the first time wondered what they knew that he didn't. What had Samuel, Eliza, and Joseph understood about those caves? What had drawn them there to a place of prophecy and power when they could have run anywhere outside the wind picked up? And Thomas swore he could hear it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of drums beneath the earth, and voices chanting in a language older than his nation, older than his laws, older than his right to own anything at all. The curse of Etowah had awakened, and Thomas Caldwell had for years until the date carved beside his name came true. The fever started 3 days later, not in Thomas Caldwell, but in Carson Webb. It began with sweats and chills, the kind that accompany influenza or consumption, but doctor Samuel Pettin found nothing wrong when he examined Carson at Webb Plantation. No infection in the lungs, no inflammation of the throat, no signs of disease that medical science recognized. Yet Carson lay in his bed, skin burning to the touch, muttering in a language Pettin didn't recognize. Guttural sounds that resembled Cherokee, but weren't quite right, as if the words were being spoken backward or inside out. By the 4th day, Carson was seeing things. His wife, Constance, sent word to Thomas early in the morning. When Thomas arrived, he found Carson strapped to his bed with leather restraints, thrashing with such violence that the bed frame had cracked. Foam flecked his lips, and his eyes had rolled back until only the lights showed. He keeps saying the same thing, Constance said. She was a sturdy woman, practical, not given to hysteria, but her hand shook as she gripped Thomas's arm, over and over in English. And then in that other tongue, he says, "They're counting us. They're counting us all." Thomas felt ice spread through his chest. He'd spent the past 3 days trying to convince himself that what he'd seen in the caves was merely exhaustion, darkness, playing tricks on a fearful mind, but now, looking at Carson's contorted face, he knew the truth. The caves had infected them somehow, not with disease, but with knowledge. Terrible, unwanted knowledge of what was coming. Doctor Pettin administered laudanum, enough to kill a horse, but Carson's thrashing continued. The restraints cut into his wrists, drawing blood that looked too dark, almost black in the lamplight. And through it all, that muttering continued. "Salagi Otsila, Salagi, Otsila, they're counting us all." What does it mean? Constance demanded. What happened in those caves? Thomas couldn't answer. How could he explain that they'd found their futures carved in stone? That something ancient and patient had been waiting in the dark, keeping records of every crime and every cruelty, preparing a reckoning that no law could prevent. By nightfall, 2 more men from the expedition had fallen ill. Silas Cobb sent word from his boarding house in town that he was experiencing nightmares so vivid he could no longer distinguish them from waking life. In these dreams, he said, he was being judged by figures made of smoke and stone, condemned for sins he couldn't remember committing. And Reverend Price had locked himself in his church, refusing to emerge, his voice audible through the doors as he prayed ceaselessly, begging forgiveness for trespasses he wouldn't name. Thomas stood on his porch that evening, watching the sun set over his fields. The cotton was planted now, tiny green shoots just beginning to break through the red clay. In a normal year, this would be a time of hope, of potential, but Thomas looked at those fields and solemnly Carson Webb's prophecy. Drought, failure, ruin. Margaret joined him, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey, though she rarely drank. She handed him one, and they stood in silence for a long moment. "You should leave," she said finally. "Take what money we have and go north. Start over somewhere the caves haven't marked you. Running won't change what's carved in that stone. Maybe not. But staying here guarantees you'll see it happen." Thomas drank his whiskey in one swallow. It burned but didn't warm him. Nothing seemed capable of warmth anymore. Not since the caves. The slaves know something. Samuel, Eliza, Joseph, they went to those caves deliberately. They knew what was there. Then ask them. They're gone. They vanished the night we went into the caves. I sent men to search, but it's like they melted into the forest. Margaret turned to him, and in the fading light, Thomas saw something he hadn't noticed before. Fear, yes, but also a strange kind of acceptance. Maybe that was the point. Maybe they were never meant to be found. That night, Thomas dreamed. He was back in the caves, but this time he was alone. The torches burned with cold blue light that cast no shadows, and the thrumming had resolved into distinct drum beats. Boom, 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 like a heart the size of the mountain itself. He walked deeper, past the chamber of names, into passages he hadn't explored before. The walls here were different. Instead of prophecies, they showed history. Images carved with such precision they seemed almost alive in the flickering light. He saw ships crossing an ocean, saw chains and auctions, and the separation of families. He saw fields of cotton and tobacco, saw whips rising and falling, saw countless faces twisted in anguish. And beneath each scene, written in Cherokee syllabary, he somehow understood were numbers, not dates but counts. Counts of the dead, the broken, the stolen. The passage opened into a chamber far larger than any they'd discovered. The ceiling soared upward beyond the reach of his strange blue light, and in the center stood 7 figures. They were neither solid nor transparent, existing in some state between presence and absence, Cherokee elders. He understood somehow, though they'd been dead for generations. They wore traditional dress and ceremonial masks, but beneath the masks, their eyes burned with the same blue light that illuminated the caves. One of them spoke, and Thomas understood, though the language was Cherokee. You ask what we buried here. White man, we bury memory. We buried truth. We buried the weight of what was done, and what will be done in answer. I never asked for this, Thomas said, or tried to say. His voice echoed strangely as if the cave was swallowing his words and spitting back different ones. Your asking was in your arrival. Your asking was in your ownership. Your asking was in every acre you claimed and every person you bound. The elder gestured to the walls where new carvings appeared even as Thomas watched. Plantations burning, crops failing, children dying, madness spreading like fever through the white communities. This is prophecy. Yes, but it is also justice. You write one history above the ground, we write another below it, and in the end, the earth remembers both. How do I stop it? Thomas asked. You don't. It is already written. But there is mercy in knowing your ending. You may prepare. You may account for your debts before the final sum is tallied. What debts? I inherited this plantation. I didn't start the slave trade. I'm just trying to survive in the system I was born into. The 7 figures laughed, and it was the saddest sound Thomas had ever heard. That excuse will not serve here. The earth doesn't care who started the fire, only who feeds it. And you, Thomas Caldwell, have fed it well. Another figure stepped forward. This one was younger, a woman with long dark hair and eyes that held both sorrow and rage. Your slave Samuel came to these caves seeking protection. He knew the old ways, learned them from his grandfather, who was Cherokee before he was stolen and sold. Samuel asked the spirits to hide his family, to let them become part of the land rather than property to be hunted. We granted his request. They are beyond your reach now, woven into the fabric of these mountains. They breathe in the soil and flow in the streams. They are free in a way you will never understand. Then let me go, Thomas pleaded. Let me leave this place. I'll free my slaves, sell the plantation, move north, and never return. But you won't, the woman said softly, because men like you never do. The land has its hooks in you, and pride and fear of what your peers will say you will stay. You will try to fight what's written in the stone, and you will fail, not because you're weak, but because you're fighting something older and more patient than your nation, your laws, your sense of rightness. The blue light began to fade. Thomas tried to speak, to argue, to beg, but darkness rushed in like water filling a sinking ship. He woke in his bed, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, Margaret shaking his shoulder. Morning light streamed through the windows, and for a moment Thomas thought it had been just a dream. Just a nightmare brought on by stress and whiskey. Then he looked at his hands. His palms were covered in red clay, the kind found deep in the caves, and beneath his fingernails was limestone dust. Margaret saw it, too. Her face went white. Thomas, you didn't, but he had. Somehow, in sleep or trance, or whatever state had possessed him, Thomas had returned to the caves. His nightshirt was torn, his feet bloody from walking barefoot over stone, and when he checked his study, his father's ledger was open on the desk to a page he didn't remember writing. In handwriting, that was his, but somehow not his. Someone had written a single sentence in Cherokee syllabary. The countdown has begun. Carson Webb died that afternoon. Dr. Petton said it was fever. Said the body simply gave out under the stress. But the slaves who prepared the body for burial whispered something different. They said his heart had stopped because it had been counting down from some number only it knew, and when it reached 0, there was nothing left but silence. That evening Thomas went to the quarters. He rarely visited them directly. That was the overseer's job, or had been before Dutch Morgan vanished into the caves. The enslaved people of Caldwell Manor lived in a row of small wooden cabins behind the main house, each one housing an entire family in a single room. Smoke rose from cook fires, and children played in the dirt while their parents returned from the fields, exhausted, defeated, enduring. Thomas found an old man named Josiah sitting outside his cabin, carving something from a piece of hickory wood. Josiah had been on the plantation longer than Thomas had been alive, brought over from Virginia in Thomas's grandfather's time. He was bent with age and labor, but his eyes were sharp and knowing. Mr. Josiah, Thomas said, feeling foolish using the honorific, but needing something from this man that couldn't be demanded. I need to ask you about the caves. Josiah's hands stilled on his carving. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then which caves would those be? Master Caldwell, you know which ones. The Cherokee caves near Etowah Creek, the one Samuel took his family to. Samuel and his family run north. That's what you told the other masters. That's what you put in your reports. We both know that's not true. Josiah resumed his carving, shaving thin curls of wood that fell like pale leaves. What you know and what you can prove are different things. And what you can prove and what you can change are different still. I saw things in those caves, Thomas said quietly, impossible things. Prophecies carved in stone. My death, the plantation burning. I need to know if there is a way to change it. Why would there be? The question was so simple, so direct that Thomas had no ready answer. Because he deserved a second chance. Because his death wasn't fair. Because the land he'd inherited shouldn't carry consequences for crimes he didn't personally commit. Because I'm afraid, Thomas admitted finally. I'm afraid of dying. I'm afraid of what comes after. I'm afraid that everything I've built will turn to ash, and my name will be remembered only for cruelty. Josiah looked up then, meeting Thomas's eyes directly in a way that would get a slave beaten on most plantations. Now you know how we feel every day of our lives. Welcome to being property of the land instead of owner of it. Welcome to knowing your ending, being powerless to change it. Welcome to the fear that eats at you from the inside until there's nothing left but the waiting. So there's no way out, no way to appease whatever's in those caves. There's always a way, Josiah said, but it's not the way you'll want to take. The Cherokee spirits, they don't want your blood or your death. They want the scales balanced. They want the debts paid, all of them going back generations. Can you do that, Master Caldwell? Can you free 47 people and give them land and compensation for stolen lives? Can you tear down this house built on suffering and plant crops you'll harvest with your own hands? Can you make yourself small and powerless in service of making others whole? Thomas said nothing. They both knew the answer. I thought not. Josiah returned to his carving. Then you'll die in 1840, just like the stone says. And maybe that's justice, too. Maybe that's the price the land demands. One way or another, Master Caldwell, debts always come due. Thomas walked back to the main house as darkness fell. The sky was clear, full of stars that seemed indifferent to human concerns. Somewhere in the mountains, drums were beating. Somewhere in the earth, the countdown continued, and in the caves beneath the breathing hills, 7 spirits waited patiently for prophecy to become history. Spring brought no relief. The drought began subtly, a week without rain, then 2, then a month. The cotton shoots that had seemed so promising in February withered by April, their leaves curling and brown despite desperate irrigation efforts. Thomas ordered his enslaved workers to haul water from Etowah Creek in wooden buckets, a brutal task that left them exhausted and resentful. But the creek itself was running low, exposing stones that hadn't seen sunlight in living memory. Other plantations suffered the same affliction. Henderson Estate lost half its tobacco crop to mysterious blight. Webb Plantation, now run by Carson's widow, Constance, saw its livestock sicken and die. First the pigs, then the cattle, then even the chickens stopped laying eggs. And everywhere, in whispered conversations between the planters, the same question circulated. Why? But Thomas knew why. The caves had spoken, and the land was listening. Reverend Price emerged from his self-imposed exile in early May, gaunt and hollow-eyed, claiming he'd received a vision from God. He called an emergency meeting at the Methodist Church, and despite their skepticism, the plantation owners attended. They were desperate for answers, for someone to explain why their prosperity was crumbling like dry clay. Thomas sat in the back pew. Margaret beside him. She'd grown thinner over the past months, existing on tea and anxiety jumping at every sound. She kept her hands folded in her lap, but Thomas could see them trembling. Price stood at the pulpit, gripping it so hard his knuckles were white. When he spoke, his voice had lost its former confidence, replaced by the wavering tone of a man who'd seen something that shattered his faith and rebuilt it into something stranger. Brothers and sisters, he began, I have wrestled with angels and demons. I have prayed for guidance, for understanding, for mercy, and the Lord has shown me the truth, though it brings me no comfort. He paused, scanning the assembled faces. Thomas counted 18 plantation owners, their wives, a handful of overseers and merchants, the people who ran Murray County, who shaped its economy and enforced its laws. We are being judged, Price continued, not by the laws of men or even by the laws of the federal government, but by something older. The Cherokee walked this land for thousands of years before we came. They knew its spirits, communed with forces we dismiss as superstition, and when we drove them west, when we took their sacred places and defiled them with our presence, those forces did not simply vanish, they waited. Someone in the front row, Thomas thought it was James Henderson, stood up angrily. This is Cherokee sympathizing. Reverend, the Indians were heathens. We brought civilization and Christianity to a savage wilderness. Civilization? Price's laugh was sharp. Bitter. Is it civilized to own human beings? Is it Christian to separate mothers from children and sell them like cattle? Is it righteous to build wealth on the backs of people who have no choice, no freedom, no hope? The church erupted in angry mutters. Several people stood to leave, but Price raised his voice, commanding attention through sheer desperation. I have seen what waits in those caves. His words echoed off the wooden walls. I have seen the prophecies, and I know they're coming true. Carson Webb, dead of fever, drought killing our crops, livestock dying without cause, and worse things are coming, fires, floods, madness, death. It's all written in the stone, dated in detail like entries in a ledger. We are being balanced against our debts, and we are found wanting. Then what do you propose? Margaret spoke up, surprising Thomas. Her voice was steady despite her shaking hands. If we're damned, what's the point of the sermon? Price looked at her with something approaching gratitude, repentance, restitution. We must free the enslaved people, return the stolen land, make reparations for. The church dissolved into chaos. Men shouted, women gasped, and Thomas saw the fury in his neighbors' faces. Free the slaves, return the land. It was economic suicide, social destruction, the unraveling of everything they'd built. Thomas stood and pushed his way outside, needing air, needing space. He wasn't surprised when he heard footsteps behind him. Margaret and surprisingly Josiah's daughter Ruth, who served as a house slave at Caldwell Manor. Ruth was 24, intelligent, and skilled at making herself invisible when white people spoke freely. But now she looked directly at Thomas, and he saw no fear in her eyes, only a kind of sad knowing. "It won't work," she said quietly. "What won't work?" Thomas asked, though he knew she'd been listening at the church door. "Freeing us. The spirits don't want freedom now. They want accountability for what already happened. You can't undo 200 years of stealing and killing and breaking families. You can only face what's coming. How do you know what the spirits want?" Ruth's smile was gentle, pitying. "Because I listened when my grandmother taught me the old songs. Because I paid attention when Samuel came back from the caves and told us what he learned. Because unlike you, Master Caldwell, I understand that some debts can only be paid in blood and time." She turned and walked back toward the plantation, leaving Thomas and Margaret standing in the churchyard. The sun beat down mercilessly, and in the distance thunder rumbled despite the cloudless sky. "She's right," Margaret said. "Whatever Price thinks he can do, it's too late. We're going to die here, aren't we?" "All of us. The dates are already written." Thomas wanted to deny it, to rage against the unfairness of being punished for a system he'd inherited rather than created. But looking at his wife's resigned face, at the dying crops in the distance, at the mountains where the caves waited with their terrible knowledge, he found he couldn't lie any more. "Yes," he said simply, "I think we are." That night, Thomas did something he'd never done before. He gathered all 47 enslaved people on his plantation, men, women, children, and spoke to them as equals rather than property. They assembled in front of the main house, confusion and fear on their faces. Masters didn't call meetings at night. Masters didn't speak to entire groups of slaves at once. It violated every social code, every power structure that kept the system functioning. Thomas stood on his porch, lantern in hand, Margaret beside him. He looked at the assembled faces and saw weariness, exhaustion, and beneath it all a kind of patient endurance that shamed him. "I went into the Cherokee caves," he began without preamble. "I saw prophecies carved in stone. My death is written there for 1840. The destruction of this plantation is written for 1841. Everything I've built, everything my father and grandfather built is going to burn." Silence greeted this announcement. The enslaved people exchanged glances, but said nothing. "Samuel, Eliza, and Joseph are gone," Thomas continued. "They found a way out that I can't follow or prevent. And I realized something you all know about the caves. You've always known. Your grandparents knew and their grandparents before them. The Cherokee shared their knowledge with some of you, taught you the old ways, and you've been waiting for the prophecies to come true. Waiting for justice." Josiah stepped forward from the crowd. "What do you want from us, Master Caldwell?" "Absolution, forgiveness, some kind of answer that makes your ending easier." "No," Thomas said and meant it. "I want to know what happens next. Not to me, I owe my fate, but to you. When the plantations burn and the masters die, what happens to the enslaved people?" It was Ruth who answered, speaking clearly in the night air. "We become part of the land. The Cherokee spirits promised Samuel that any of us who wanted could join them. Become woven into these hills the way our ancestors are woven into the African soil we were stolen from. We'll be free in a way that has nothing to do with papers or laws. We'll be wind and water, stone and root, memory and prophecy. We'll outlast every plantation, every master, every attempt to own what cannot be owned. And those who don't want that, they'll go north." Josiah said, "When the chaos comes, when the old system breaks, we'll walk away and no one will have the power to stop us. The prophecies aren't just about white people dying, Master Caldwell. They're about us living." Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not quite acceptance, but a kind of exhausted surrender. "Then I won't stop you. When the time comes, when whatever's going to happen starts happening, I won't send catchers or raise alarms. All he struggled for words. I'll bear witness. That's all I can offer. That's more than most would offer, Ruth said, but it doesn't change your ending. The stone knows what you've done and what you've failed to do. The debt is still owed. I know. The gathering dispersed slowly. Enslaved people returning to their quarters with new knowledge. Their master was dying. His power was failing. And soon, very soon, they would be free. Not through legislation or moral awakening, but through something far older and more implacable. Margaret and Thomas stood on the porch long after everyone left. The night was warm, humid, heavy with the promise of storms that wouldn't come. In the mountains, drums beat their steady rhythm, and Thomas wondered if they were counting down days or heartbeats, or some measure of justice that human mathematics couldn't calculate. "What will you do with the time you have left?" Margaret asked. Thomas thought about that. A year and a half until his death, according to the stone. 18 months to account for 36 years of life. Most of it lived in the service of a system he'd never questioned until it carved his doom into sacred rock. "I'll write it down," he decided. "Everything I've seen, everything I understand now, I'll leave a record so that when people find the ruins of this place, they'll know why it fell. They'll know it wasn't just economics or politics or disease. They'll know the land itself rose up and balanced the scales. Doom? Will anyone believe it? Probably not. But that doesn't mean it shouldn't be written." They went inside and Thomas began his chronicle. He wrote by candlelight while Margaret slept fitfully upstairs, recording everything that had happened since February, the discovery of the caves, the prophecies, the dreams, the slow unraveling of Murray County's prosperity. He wrote about the enslaved people who were more than property, about Cherokee spirits who were more than superstition, about debts that transcended any ledger. He wrote until dawn, and when he finally stopped, his hand cramping around the pen, he looked at what he'd produced and knew it was inadequate. Words couldn't capture the thrumming of the caves, or the weight of carved prophecy, or the patient rage of spirits who waited generations for justice. But words were all he had, so words would have to be enough. Outside, the sun rose on fields that were dying. The countdown continued, and in the caves beneath the breathing hills, 7 spirits added new names to their walls, new dates to their calendar of reckoning. The curse of Etowah was unfolding exactly as written, and Thomas Caldwell could only watch and wait for his part in the story to end. Summer arrived like a fever dream. By June, the drought had become catastrophic. Etowah Creek dried to a trickle, exposing a creek bed littered with bones. Animal bones, or so everyone claimed, though some were suspiciously human in size and shape. The cotton crop was a complete loss, leaving Thomas with acres of dead stalks that rattled in the hot wind like the whisper of ghosts. Other plantations fared no better, and the mood in Murray County turned desperate, then dangerous. Thomas spent his days maintaining routines that no longer had meaning. He kept his account books, though there was no income to record. He walked his fields, though there was nothing to inspect but failure. He attended church on Sundays, though Reverend Price's sermons had devolved into apocalyptic rants that frightened more than comforted. And each night he added to his chronicle, documenting the slow collapse of everything he'd known. The first fire came in mid-July. Henderson Estate burned on a Tuesday evening, flames visible for miles against the darkening sky. By the time Thomas arrived with the volunteer fire brigade, there was nothing to save. The main house had collapsed, the slave quarters were ash, and the fields were scorched earth. James Henderson survived, but barely, pulled from the flames by his enslaved people. Ironically enough, his body so badly burned that Dr. Pettin said he wouldn't last a week. It started in multiple places at once. One of the firefighters reported, "East wing, west wing, and the barn all igniting within minutes of each other. No way it was accidental." But there had been no intruders, no signs of arson, no explanation beyond the prophecy carved in stone. Henderson Estate burned 1839. James Henderson died 3 days later, his last words allegedly a confession that no one would repeat in polite company. The rumors said he tried to sell some of his enslaved people to cover debts, tried to separate families, and that very night the fire started. Cause and effect, action and consequence, as certain as gravity. Thomas stood at Henderson's funeral, watching the pine coffin being lowered into red clay, and thought about the date carved beside his own name. 1840. He had less than 6 months left. The fear had changed from something acute to something chronic, a constant background hum like the drumming from the caves. He no longer startled at every sound or jumped at shadows. Instead, he moved through each day with the exhausted acceptance of a condemned man counting down his final hours. Margaret had stopped speaking almost entirely. She drifted through Caldwell Manor like a ghost herself, touching furniture as if memorizing its solidity before it, too, dissolved into prophecy. Sometimes Thomas would find her standing in their daughter's old room, the one they kept sealed since the fever took her, just staring at the empty bed and crying soundlessly. The enslaved people of Caldwell Manor had changed, too. They still were. Habit and survival demanded it, but the fear was gone. Thomas saw it in their eyes, heard it in the songs they sang in the quarters. They were waiting for something, and unlike Thomas, they weren't dreading it. They were anticipating liberation, whether through death or transformation, or simply the collapse of the system that bound them. Ruth approached Thomas one August evening as he sat on the porch, watching the sun set over his dying fields. She carried a tray with dinner he knew he wouldn't eat, and a glass of whiskey he definitely would. "Master Caldwell," she said, using the title with a kind of ironic formality that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "May I speak plainly?" "You always have." "Ruth, don't stop now." She sat down the tray and stood at the porch rail, looking out at the same view he'd been contemplating. "People are leaving. 3 families gone this week, slipped away in the night. You haven't sent anyone after them. What would be the point exactly?" Ruth turned to face him. "The other masters, though, they're getting desperate. They're forming patrols, increasing punishments, talking about making examples. They can feel everything slipping away, and they're trying to hold on through violence." Thomas had heard the same reports. Whipping had increased across the county, and 2 enslaved men had been hanged in public as a warning. The white community was fracturing between those who sensed change coming and tried to accelerate their cruelty before time ran out, and those like Thomas who simply surrendered to the inevitable. "I won't stop people from leaving," Thomas said, "but I can't protect them from other plantation owners either. If they're caught beyond my property, they won't be." Ruth's certainty was absolute. "The spirits are guiding them. The ones who want to go north are finding paths that don't appear on any map, and the ones who want to stay to become part of the land like Samuel and his family, they are being called to the caves. Have you decided which path you'll take?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "I'm going to the caves, not because I want to die or disappear, but because I want to remember. The spirits are making an archive of everything that happened here, every cruelty, every small kindness, every moment of resistance and survival. They're carving it into stone so that it can never be erased or rewritten. I want to be part of that memory. You'll give up your life." "No, Master Caldwell, I'll give up being property." "That's not the same thing." She left him with that thought, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Thomas drank his whiskey and watched stars emerge in a cloudless sky. Somewhere in the mountains the drums beat their steady rhythm, counting down to something he couldn't quite imagine, but knew with terrible certainty was coming. September brought strange occurrences. Animals behaved erratically, dogs howling for no reason, horses refusing to enter certain areas, birds falling dead from the sky. The enslaved people whispered about seeing figures in the fields at night, Cherokee spirits walking between the cotton rows, counting, always counting, and the dreams intensified, not just for Thomas, but for every white person who had any connection to the caves. Constance Webb went mad. She was found one morning in her nightgown, wandering through what remained of her husband's fields, laughing and weeping, simultaneously carrying on a conversation with someone no one else could see. When they tried to bring her inside, she fought with supernatural strength, screaming that the numbers wouldn't add up, that she'd been counted and found wanting, that the debt collector was coming. Doctor Penn prescribed more laudanum, stronger sedatives, but nothing touched whatever afflicted her. Within a week, Constance was catatonic, sitting in a chair by her window, staring at the mountains, occasionally whispering sums and calculations that made no sense to anyone listening. More fires broke out. Thompson Plantation burned. Pierce Estate burned. Each time the fire started simultaneously in multiple locations, defying natural explanation. And each time Thomas checked his chronicle and found the date matched perfectly with the prophecies carved in stone, the authorities were helpless. The county sheriff, a man named Marcus Pyle, tried to organize investigations. But what could he investigate? The fires had no natural cause. The illnesses had no medical explanation. And the general collapse of prosperity couldn't be attributed to any single factor that law enforcement could address. Reverend Price attempted an exorcism in October. He gathered volunteers at the mouth of the Cherokee caves, armed with Bibles and lanterns and righteous conviction, determined to drive out the evil spirits and reclaim the land for Christian civilization. Thomas didn't attend, but he heard about it from those who did. Price led the group into the caves, praying loudly, sprinkling holy water, calling upon God to cleanse the unholy place. They reached the first chamber, saw the prophecies carved in stone, and Price began reading scripture at the top of his lungs. His voice echoing through the passages, the drum stopped. In the sudden silence, they heard breathing, slow, deep, ancient breathing that seemed to come from the stone itself. Then the torches went out all at once, leaving them in absolute darkness. And in that darkness, they heard voices, not Cherokee voices, but their own voices, speaking words they never said, confessing sins they tried to forget, admitting to cruelties they justified or denied. The group fled in panic. Price emerged last, his hair turned white, his Bible torn to shreds by hands that weren't his own. He never spoke coherently again, spending his final days in a rocking chair, flinching at sounds no one else could hear. By November, Thomas was one of the few plantation owners still functional. Others had died, gone mad, or simply abandoned their properties and fled north. The enslaved people were leaving in a steady stream, sometimes entire families at once, walking into the mountains and never returning. No one pursued them anymore. There was no point. Josiah came to see Thomas on a cold November afternoon. The old man looked younger somehow, as if the approaching end had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Josiah said without preamble. "Taking my family north. Just wanted to tell you in person." "I'm glad," Thomas said and meant it. "You've earned freedom more than anyone I know." "Not earn. Freedom isn't something you earn. It's something that should never have been taken." Josiah pulled something from his pocket, a small carving, the same one he'd been working on months ago. It had taken shape, a bird in flight, wings spread, leaving a nest behind. "This is for you, to remember that some things can't be caged forever." Thomas took the carving, feeling its smooth edges, the careful detail in each feather. "Thank you, Josiah, for this and for your patience with a man who understood too late. Understanding late is better than never understanding at all." Josiah turned to leave, then paused. "The spirits told Ruth to tell you something. Your death date, 1840, it's not just about you dying. It's about who you are dying." Thomas Caldwell, the slave owner. Thomas Caldwell, the plantation master, that man has to die. What comes after, if anything comes after, that's up to you. He walked away, and Thomas never saw him again, but he kept the carved bird on his desk next to his chronicle, a reminder that transformation sometimes looks like destruction. December arrived with frost and clarity. Thomas walked his empty fields past abandoned quarters and silent barns. Margaret had retreated entirely into herself, spending days in bed, speaking only to decline meals or ask what day it was. The plantation was a shell, a ghost of prosperity built on suffering, now returning to the earth that had never truly been his own. On Christmas Eve, Thomas made his final entry in his chronicle. His hand was steadier than it had been in months. His mind cleared despite, or perhaps because of the approaching end. "They call it a curse," he wrote. "But curses are just consequences we didn't expect to pay. The Cherokee spirits didn't doom us. We doomed ourselves the moment we decided some human beings could own others. That land could be claimed through violence. That prosperity built on suffering will last forever. In 6 weeks I will die. The date is written in stone, and I find I'm no longer afraid. I'm tired, and I'm ready for whatever accounting comes next. I only hope that what rises from the ruins of this place is more just, more merciful, more human than what we build here. To whoever reads this, learn from our mistakes. Understand that debts always come due, that land remembers, that justice delayed is not justice denied. And know that the drumming you hear in the mountains is not a threat, but a promise. The earth is patient, but the earth is keeping score. The curse of Etowah was our own making. We just didn't want to believe it until the bill came due. Thomas closed the journal and placed it in a metal box which he buried beneath the largest oak tree on his property. Whether anyone would ever find it, he didn't know. But at least the truth would exist somewhere, preserved against the fire and flood and madness that he knew were coming. The new year arrived, 1840, Thomas Caldwell's final year of life. He faced it with exhausted peace, waiting for prophecy to become history, for debt to become payment, for the curse of Etowah to complete its terrible work. January 1840 came wrapped in ice. A freak winter storm swept through Georgia, coating everything in crystalline shells that turned the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Tree branches bowed under the weight. Power lines that didn't exist yet in Thomas's imagination would have snapped, and the roads became impossible ribbons of frozen treachery. Thomas spent much of the month indoors, tending fires that never seemed to warm the house, watching Margaret's decline, and waiting. The waiting was the worst part, knowing your death date, but not the method, the hour, the specific mechanism that would transform prophecy into reality. The isolation suited him. With the roads frozen, no one visited, no one brought news of the outside world. Caldwell Manor became a small kingdom unto itself, populated by ghosts of different kinds, the memory of prosperity, the echo of enslaved voices now silent, the weight of Margaret's unspoken grief, and Thomas's own fading sense of self. Ruth was one of the few who remained. She decided to stay through winter, claiming the spirits had asked her to witness whatever was coming to be able to tell the story accurately when the time came. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, preparing meals that mostly went uneaten, maintaining routines that no longer served any purpose beyond marking time's passage. "You should go," Thomas told her one evening they were in the study, Ruth refilling the oil lamps while Thomas pretended to read. "Whatever is going to happen, you don't need to see it." "But I do." Ruth set down the lamp oil and faced him directly. "The spirits are very specific about this. They want multiple perspectives recorded, multiple witnesses to what happens when prophecy completes itself. Your chronicle tells one story, the master's story, full of guilt and resignation, but I'm here to tell another story. The story of how it looked from the quarters, from the position of property becoming person." "And what does that story say?" Ruth smiled softly. "That justice is slow but inevitable, that the land remembers everything, counts everything, and eventually balances the scales. That you white people thought you could own the earth, own other humans, own the future itself. But you were wrong. The earth owns you, always has." February brought a thaw and with it visitors. The few remaining plantation owners formed what they called a mutual protection society, though Thomas knew it was really just a gathering of frightened men trying to convince each other that the world still made sense. They met at what remained of the Webb estate, now managed by Constance's brother, who'd come down from Virginia to settle the property. Thomas attended reluctantly, more out of morbid curiosity than any hope of finding solutions. The group consisted of 7 men, down from the 18 who'd attended Reverend Price's sermon the previous year. Death, madness, and flight had winnowed their numbers considerably. The meeting was tense, desperate. Talk centered on sending for federal troops, requesting military intervention to restore order. Though no one could quite articulate what order meant when your crops had failed, your labor force had fled, and your own mortality was written in stone in a cave you couldn't destroy or seal. "We should burn them," suggested William Pierce, whose estate had been consumed by fire 6 months earlier. He'd survived, but was clearly unstable, his hands shaking, his eyes too bright. Burn the caves, collapse the tunnels, destroy the prophecies. Can't come true if the words are destroyed. Fire won't work on stone, Thomas said quietly. And besides, the prophecies aren't creating the future, they're just reporting it. That's defeatist talk, Caldwell. I've accepted reality. The argument escalated. Voices raised in that particular way frighten men out when they know they're powerless, but refuse to admit it. Eventually, the group decided to petition the state governor for assistance to send representatives to the capital to seek help from authorities who had no more power over Cherokee spirits than they did over the weather. Thomas left before the meeting concluded, riding home through February mud, feeling the countdown in his bones. Less than 11 months now, less than a year until whatever mechanism the prophecy had set in motion reached its conclusion. He found Margaret in the parlor, sitting in her usual chair by the window staring at nothing. She'd taken to the spot months ago, and sometimes Thomas wondered if she was already dead. If only her body remained while her mind had fled to some safer distance. "Margaret," he said gently, sitting across from her, "can you hear me?" A long pause, then a small nod. "I need to tell you something. I'm going to die this year. You already know that, but I need to say it out loud. And when I'm gone, you should leave this place. Go back to your family in Carolina, or go north, anywhere but here. This land is poisoned now, and it'll kill you, too, if you stay." Margaret's eyes focused on him slowly, as if she was surfacing from deep water. "We're already dead, Thomas. Both of us. We died the day we claimed to own other people. What's coming is just the formality of it." Her clarity shocked him more than her previous silence. "You understand what's happening?" "Of course, I understand. I've always understood." Margaret's voice was stronger now, carrying an edge of something almost like anger. "You men, you think you're the only ones paying attention, the only ones keeping score, but I counted too, Thomas. I counted the children sold away from their mothers. I counted the scars on backs, the tears at night, the prayers for death. I counted my own complicity, my own comfort built on others' agony. And I knew long before you went into those caves that there would be a reckoning. Then why didn't you say anything? What would I have said? Stop, change, free them all. You would have thought me hysterical, or mad, or dangerously radical. And I was afraid, Thomas, afraid of poverty, afraid of social censure, afraid of having to actually live by the Christian principles we claim to believe. So I stayed quiet and counted the cost in silence. And now the bill is due for both of us." She returned her gaze to the window, and Thomas realized his wife was far braver than he'd ever been. She'd seen the truth earlier, understood the consequences sooner, and had spent these years preparing for an end she knew was inevitable. Spring arrived with violent beauty. Storms rolled through Murray County with biblical intensity. Torrential rains, lightning that struck the same spots repeatedly, hail that destroyed the few crops anyone had been foolish enough to plant. The earth seemed to be cleansing itself, washing away the structures and systems that had poisoned it for so long. More plantations burned, more owners died. The population of Murray County had dropped by nearly 40%, and the enslaved population had vanished almost entirely. Those who remained were either too old, too sick, or too young to make the journey north. And even they were disappearing into the mountains, called by drums that grew louder with each passing week. In April, Thomas received a letter from the state capitol. It was brief, formal, and utterly useless. The governor expressed sympathy for the unfortunate circumstances affecting Murray County, but could offer no material assistance beyond prayers and the suggestion that residents maintain faith in divine providence. Thomas burned the letter in his study fireplace and watched the paper curl and blacken. Faith in divine providence, as if God were intervening rather than simply allowing consequences to unfold, as if prayer could undo generations of theft and violence. Ruth found him there staring at the ashes. "It's almost time," she said simply. "How do you know?" "The spirits told me." They say the prophecies are nearly complete, that only a few more dominoes need to fall before the final act. They're preparing the caves for the last ceremony, the one that will seal everything that's happened here into permanent memory. And my part in that ceremony, you'll know when it happens. Thomas wanted to press for details, but Ruth's expression told him she'd share all she was permitted to. Instead, he asked, "Are you afraid?" "No," Ruth said, and he believed her. "I'm ready to become part of something larger than myself, larger than this individual life." The spirits promise that everyone who joins them will exist as long as the mountains stand, as long as the stone remembers. That's more immortality than you plantation owners ever achieved with your big houses and your family names. She left him with that thought. Thomas returned to the window and saw in the distance smoke rising from the mountains, not forest fire smoke, but the deliberate smoke of ceremonial fires, thick and white and purposeful. The Cherokee spirits were gathering their strength for something momentous, made past in a blur. Thomas stopped keeping track of days, stopped maintaining routines. He'd released the last few enslaved people still on his property, signed papers granting them freedom, though he knew such papers meant nothing in the larger scheme. Margaret had taken to her bed permanently, accepting food and water only when Ruth insisted, speaking rarely, and then only in fragments. The house felt enormous and empty, rooms echoing with absence. Thomas wandered through them, touching furniture, examining possessions that would soon belong to no one. He thought about his father, his grandfather, all the Caldwells who'd built their prosperity on this land. What would they think of him, the last of the line, watching it all collapse without resistance? Probably that he was weak. Probably that he should have fought harder, whipped more, enforced the system with greater violence. But Thomas was beyond caring what dead men thought. He'd seen the futility of their vision, understood the bankruptcy of their values. Let the Caldwell name die with him. The world would be better for it. June arrived with unbearable heat. The drought returned more severe than the previous year. The creek dried completely, leaving a bed of cracked mud and exposed bones. The forest seemed to press closer to the plantation house, reclaiming spaces that had been cleared generations ago. Nature was taking back what had been forcibly borrowed, and Thomas could only watch the slow erasure of everything his family had built. On June 15th, a date Thomas would later realize was exactly 1 year after the Henderson estate burned, Ruth came to him with a message. "It's time," she said. "The spirits want you to come to the caves tonight when the moon rises. They say the final accounting is ready and you need to witness it." "Will I come back?" Ruth considered the question carefully. "That depends on what you bring with you and what you're willing to leave behind." Thomas spent the afternoon preparing. He bathed, dressed in his simplest clothes, wrote a final note to Margaret, though he doubted she'd read it. He stood in his study one last time, looking at the empty shelves, the bare desk, the cold fireplace. This room had been the center of the plantation's operations, where decisions about crops and sales and human property had been made with casual brutality. Now it was just a room, powerless, meaningless, waiting for fire or rot to complete its transformation. He said goodbye to Margaret, though she didn't respond. She lay in their bed, eyes closed, breathing shallow, already halfway between worlds. Thomas kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'm sorry." Though for what specifically he couldn't say for everything, perhaps for all of it. Ruth was waiting on the porch as the sun set. She carried a small bundle of supplies and wore traditional Cherokee dress that Thomas had never seen her wear before. Deerskin decorated with beadwork patterns that suggested both mourning and celebration. "Where did you get those clothes?" he asked. "The spirits provided them. They want me to enter the final ceremony dressed appropriately, honoring both my African ancestors and the Cherokee spirits who are welcoming us." They walked in silence as darkness fell. The path to the caves was clear now, as if it had been traveled frequently, as if hundreds of feet had worn the route into the earth itself. The drums were loud, no longer distant or mysterious, but immediate, real, calling them forward with hypnotic insistence. Other figures walked the path, too, shadows that might have been human, might have been spirit. might have been something between. They nodded to Ruth and Thomas, but didn't speak, all moving toward the same destination with the same mixture of purpose and resignation. The cave entrance glowed with firelight. Thomas could see the flickering orange light spilling out into the night, and as they drew closer, he heard voices, Cherokee voices singing in harmony with the drums, words he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. Ending, beginning, judgment, mercy, memory, justice. Ruth took his hand. Whatever you see in there, whatever happens, know that it's been coming for a long time. This isn't cruelty. This is balance. They entered the caves together, and Thomas Caldwell walked willingly into prophecy. The main chamber had been transformed. Where Thomas remembered crude stone and carved prophecies, now there was an elaborate gathering space lit by hundreds of small fires. The flames burned without smoke, casting light that seemed to come from within the stone itself. The walls pulsed with that light, and the prophecies carved there glowed gold and red like fresh winds. 7 figures stood in the center, the same Cherokee elders Thomas had seen in his dream, but solid now, present, undeniable. They wore ceremonial masks and traditional dress, and they stood in a perfect circle around a stone altar that hadn't existed during Thomas's first visit. Arrayed around the chamber's perimeter were others. Thomas recognized some: Samuel, Eliza, young Joseph, looking peaceful and whole. Josiah was there, and dozens of other enslaved people from plantations across Murray County. But they weren't quite solid, weren't quite ghosts. They existed in some liminal state, present and absent simultaneously, belonging to the earth now rather than to any master. And beyond them, filling every shadow and corner, were Cherokee spirits, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, the accumulated dead of centuries, all gathered to witness this final ceremony. Ruth led Thomas to a spot near the altar. She squeezed his hand once, then released it, and moved to join the other formerly enslaved people, taking her place among those who'd chosen transformation over flight. One of the 7 elders stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice filled the chamber with a resonance that made Thomas's bones vibrate. Thomas Caldwell, last son of the Caldwell line, last master of 300 stolen acres. You have been called to witness the completion of the prophecies and to receive your accounting. Thomas found his voice, though it shook. I'm ready. Are you? The elder's eyes behind his mask were ancient, knowing you believe yourself prepared because you've accepted your death. But death is not the debt we're here to collect. Death is easy. Transformation is hard. The other elders moved, and the stone altar between them changed. Its surface became reflective, not like mirror glass, but like water. Dark, deep water that reflected things that weren't in the chamber. Thomas saw images forming, scenes from his life played out in supernatural clarity. He saw himself as a boy learning from his father how to manage property, how to calculate the value of human beings, how to maintain authority through violence and fear. He saw himself as a young man inheriting the plantation without question, stepping into his father's role as naturally as he'd stepped into his father's boots. He saw individual moments of cruelty, a whipping he'd ordered for a slave who talked back, the sale of a family to cover gambling debts, the casual indifference with which he'd sentenced people to lifelong bondage. And worse than the act of cruelty, he saw the passive acceptance. All the times he could have spoken against the system, could have freed his enslaved people, could have used his privilege to challenge rather than perpetuate injustice, but chose comfort and conformity instead. The water altar showed him the consequences of those choices. Children growing up without parents, families torn apart by sales and transfers. The accumulated suffering of hundreds of people whose lives had been shaped by his decisions or his father's or his grandfather's. The weight of it was staggering, unbearable, and Thomas sank to his knees. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't understand. You knew, the elder interrupted, voice sharp as broken stone. You always knew. You simply chose not to look, chose not to care, chose the comfort of ignorance over the discomfort of conscience. That's the real debt, Thomas Caldwell. Not what you did, but what you failed to do. Thomas couldn't argue. The altar's water showed him the truth in his heart. buried under layers of social conditioning and economic self-interest. He'd always known the system was evil. He'd simply lacked the courage to oppose it. "What happens now?" he asked. The 7 elders moved as one, and the chamber's atmosphere shifted. The fires burned brighter, the drums intensified, and Thomas felt something pulling at him, tugging at his very essence. Like a tide pulling sand from a beach. "Now comes the choice," the elder said. "You have been counted and measured against your debts. The scales are not balanced. You have consumed more than you contributed, taken more than you gave, caused more harm than healing. The standard judgment would be dissolution. Your spirit scattered to the 4 winds, erased from memory as thoroughly as you tried to erase the humanity of those you enslaved." Thomas felt terror, then genuine existential horror at the idea of complete annihilation. However, the elder continued, "There is another path. The land is willing to accept you, to incorporate you into its memory and its ongoing work, but only if you release everything you were. Your name, your identity, your sense of self and separation. You would become part of the stones that count, the earth that remembers, the wind that carries stories. You would exist, but not as Thomas Caldwell. You would serve, but not as master. You would remember, but the memories would belong to the land rather than to you." "That's death," Thomas protested weakly. "No," Ruth spoke from her place among the transformed. "That's rebirth. That's joining something larger than your individual life, becoming part of the permanent record. I'm taking that path, Thomas. So are hundreds of others. We're choosing to become memory to ensure that what happened here is never forgotten or rewritten. Join us." Thomas looked around the chamber. He saw Samuel and his family peaceful in their new existence. He saw Josiah, who nodded encouragingly. He saw so many faces of people he claimed to own, now free in a way he could barely comprehend. And he saw something else in the altar's water. Margaret lying in their bed at Caldwell Manor. As he watched, her breathing stopped, her spirit rising from her body like mist. But instead of moving toward light or judgment, she drifted toward the mountains, toward these caves, drawn by the same pull that had brought him here. "Margaret chose this too?" Thomas asked. Stunned, "Your wife understood long before you did," the elder confirmed. "She's been preparing for this moment, releasing her attachments, making herself ready for transformation. She arrives soon and make the same choice you're being offered." Thomas thought about his life, his legacy, his name. The Caldwell family would end here, erased from history books, forgotten by future generations. The plantation would burn or fall to ruin, and no one would remember the prosperity built on suffering, and he found he was okay with that. "I accept," Thomas said, "I accept the transformation. Make me part of the record, part of the remembering. Let the Caldwell name die, but let the trip survive." The 7 elders raised their hands, and the chamber erupted with sound, drums thundering, voices chanting, the earth itself groaning as if giving birth to something new. Thomas felt his body dissolving not painfully, but strangely like salt dissolving in water. His memories remained, but became disconnected from ego, from self. He was Thomas Caldwell, but he was also the red clay and the limestone. He was the remembering and the remembered. He saw himself, his former self, standing in the chamber, growing transparent, becoming less defined, and he saw the others experiencing the same. Transformation, rift dissolving into light and stone. Samuel's family merging with the cave walls. Dozens of spirits choosing incorporation over annihilation, choosing to become the permanent record. The altar's water showed him what would happen next. Caldwell Manor would burn within the month, flames consuming the house that slavery built. The other plantations would follow one by one, just as the prophecies promised. The white families would die or flee, and the land would begin its slow healing. But the caves would remain, the prophecies would remain, the record would remain. Future generations would find this place and wonder at the detailed carvings, the precise dates, the names of plantations and owners. Archaeologists would puzzle over the sophistication of the Cherokee record, keeping the way they predicted events decades before they occurred. Historians would debate the meaning of the symbols, the significance of the rituals, the truth behind the legends of the Curse of Etowah, and the spirits, the transformed, the incorporated, the memories made manifest, would be there, woven into the stone, keeping accurate count, ensuring that no one could rewrite this history or soften its edges. Thomas felt his individual consciousness fading, merging into something larger. He was still himself, also everyone else who chose in this path. He was the counter and the counted, the witness and the witnessed, the judge and the judge. His last thought as Thomas Caldwell was gratitude. Gratitude that he'd been given the chance to become part of the solution rather than remaining part of the problem. Gratitude that his ending served some purpose beyond mere punishment. Then he wasn't Thomas anymore. He was Thomas and Ruth and Samuel and Josiah and hundreds more. He was the stone walls recording history. He was the drums beating measurements of justice. He was the memory that wouldn't fade, the story that demanded telling, the debt that had been paid through transformation rather than destruction. Margaret arrived as the transformation completed. Her spirit entered the chamber, looked at the glowing walls, understood instantly what was being offered. She didn't hesitate, walking directly to the altar and offering herself to the same process. As she dissolved into light and memory, Thomas, who was not Thomas anymore, felt her join the collective consciousness. She brought her own memories, her own guilt, her own desire for meaningful ending, and the keys accepted her, incorporated her, made her part of the eternal record. The ceremony concluded as dawn approached. The 7 Cherokee elders removed their masks, revealing faces that were neither old nor young, neither entirely spirit nor entirely flesh. They'd been performing this role for generations, maintaining the counting, the recording, the balancing of scales. "It is done," the eldest said, speaking to no one in particular and everyone at once. "The prophecies are fulfilled, the debts are paid, the record is complete." The fires in the chamber began to dim, not going out, but settling into a steady glow that would burn forever, sustained by the transformed spirits who now made the caves their home. The drums slowed to a heartbeat rhythm, steady and eternal, counting time and justice in perfect synchrony. Outside, the sun rose on June 16, 1840. Thomas Caldwell was officially dead, though no body would be found. Margaret Caldwell was dead. Caldwell Manor stood empty, waiting for the prophesied fire to reduce it to ash and memory. By July, the fire came. By August, all the major plantations in Murray County had burned or been abandoned. By the end of 1841, the landscape looked almost as it had before European settlement. Forests reclaiming cleared land, creeks running clean, wildlife returning to spaces that had been hostile to them for decades. The few white families who remained told their children about the curse of Etowah, about Cherokee spirits who'd exacted revenge, about caves that should never be disturbed. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legend, becoming myth, becoming the kind of tale that people only half believe but fully respect. And in the caves beneath the breathing hills, the spirits kept their vigil. They counted every visitor who came with reverence, every scholar who sought to understand, every descendant of enslaved people who returned to honor their ancestors. They counted but didn't curse these visitors because the curse had been specific, targeted, complete. The counting continued for other purposes now, recording acts of justice delayed but finally achieved, marking moments when truth was acknowledged rather than buried, celebrating small victories in the ongoing struggle for human dignity and freedom. The prophecies on the walls remained, but new carvings appeared alongside them. Names of enslaved people who'd escaped to freedom. Names of abolitionists who'd fought the system. Names of those who'd resisted, survived, persisted. The caves became an archive of both crime and resistance, both oppression and liberation, holding the full complexity of history in stone. Travelers passing through Georgia on cold nights still report hearing drums beneath the soil. If you listen carefully, you can hear voices singing in Cherokee and African languages, in English and in tongues that have no human name. And if you're very patient, very still, you might hear the phrase carried on the wind. We buried more than bones. We buried truth. We buried memory. We bury justice delayed but never denied. The Cherokee called it protection, the South called it a curse. But the spirits who lived in the stone knew it was simply accounting. The patient, thorough work of keeping records accurate, of ensuring that history couldn't be sanitized or forgotten, of making the land itself a witness to everything that happened upon it. And in that eternal record, Thomas Caldwell existed not as master, but as cautionary tale, not as owner, but as owned by truth, not as individual, but as part of the collective memory of a time when the scales were finally, painfully, necessarily balanced. The curse of Etowah was complete. The prophecies were fulfilled. The debts were paid in transformation in memory in the permanent record carved into sacred stone. And the earth patient and thorough continued its work of remembering, counting, and bearing witness to the truth that no amount of power or wealth could erase. That justice, though delayed, is never truly denied when the land itself keeps the record.